This video is going to serve as a part 2 of the VRto3D setup guide. I would recommend watching the first part of this video first because it's going to cover the new location of the default configuration. It has been moved to Documents, My Games, VRto3D default config.json. Now that location doesn't exist initially, but you will install VRto3D and run SteamVR once, and it will generate this configuration for you to modify. Then go back to part 1 and you can watch all of the in-depth details on what all the settings in this configuration do. This is going to cover the changes in the version 2.0 of VRto3D. The main thing here is that the configuration has been streamlined a little bit so it's easier to modify and share profiles for games. So to start off with, let's go and do a clean uninstall of VRto3D. So we're going to go to our Steam folder. We'll go down to steamapps, common, SteamVR, drivers, and I'm going to delete this folder here. And then also I need to go back to Steam, and then config, scroll down, I'm going to delete my SteamVR VR settings. Alright, so now we're ready to go and install the new version. I'm going to go back to steamapps, common, SteamVR, and then drivers, and now you can download it from the link in the description. I'm just downloading this VRto3D zip. I already have it here, so I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And you're going to copy this VRto3D folder into your drivers folder here. Alright. And with that done, we need to go over to Steam and launch SteamVR once. And it should load up the default configuration, and what it's doing is generating a folder in your documents that will contain all of the profiles for SteamVR and VRto3D. Alright, so now it's loaded. We're going to go ahead and close it out again. And Steam will close. That's normal. And we're going to navigate over to your Documents folder. And you're in My Documents, My Games, VRto3D. And this should now exist, this default config.json. So I'll go ahead and open this up, and you can see this is basically the same format as in the previous version 1 of VRto3D, just in a different location. There's a few key changes here. There's a new control toggle type that can be set to either toggle or hold. And what this does is allow you to either toggle off the pitch and yaw emulation, or you can hold it off. Like if you were using a weapon wheel or something, you don't want the camera swinging to and fro. You just want to temporarily have it off while you're holding the weapon wheel button. The other thing, there's no more number of user settings that used to be right here. There's now just this array of user settings. So this is hopefully a little bit more concise or clear to use. So if you want to add a user setting preset, it's as simple as you copy one and you paste it in, and then you got to change the load key, which activates this depth and convergence, and the store key, which stores or overwrites this depth and convergence, so that it can be used in a profile. Some other changes that have been made since that first video are the addition of being able to save a profile. So all the depth and convergence settings and hotkeys, pitch and yaw emulation settings, you'll press Control F7 while the game is running, and it will create a new profile over here in your Documents folder. And we'll demonstrate that in a little bit. You can also reload at any time whatever the current state of this default JSON is. So you can leave SteamVR running, you can make changes in here, and then press Control F10 and it will pull in whatever you have set in this default config JSON. And then also the pitch and yaw emulation, when it's enabled, you can use the Control minus and Control plus to increase the sensitivity of your joystick here. You'll want to do this as it will help alleviate the judder kind of feeling as SteamVR moves your virtual headset around. And then you can also adjust the pitch radius with Control and the square brackets. That's this one here. So you can leave this one as 0 starting a game and then just modify it in game to whatever feels comfortable. Now there are all these fields with a plus next to them, and these are denoted as ones that get reloaded whenever you press Control F10. So that's how you can know which ones are going to get reloaded. These are also all the fields that get saved to a profile for a game. Moving on to discuss per game profiles, we're going to head over to our compatibility list here. And we'll go and find Lucky again as our example. And Lucky needs pitch enable and yaw enable to work. So we're going to go over to our default config JSON. And we're going to set those two to true. And save this file. Now, if say we know we don't want this left trigger as a preset here, we can either change this to, say, numpad 3. Or we can just delete this preset entirely now without having to worry about a num user settings. So we'll just do it that way, and we'll save this, and we'll head on over to Steam and load up Lucky's Tale here. And click play. Move that over here. Alright, so I've got my controller connected, and I can use my right stick to move around in the pitch and yaw directions. Now, let's say we wanted to adjust the sensitivity of that pitch and yaw movement. We can use those hotkeys Control minus and Control plus. So I can hold Control minus and you'll see it slows to a stop. Holding Control plus, it speeds up. But let's say we wanted this slower rate here for our profile. So let's then go and have a look at the control radius. So I'm going to increase it here, and it's going to look really funny in this game because the camera is not centered on Lucky, it's offset. But you can see it moves around like so with that setting. Now there's also the depth presets we have. So there's that preset on the guide button that we have enabled. I'm going to click that and it changed the depth, and I can click it again to go back to the other setting. So let's enable that preset, and now say we want a different depth and convergence here. We can use our hotkeys to control F3, F4. So I'm going to increase the depth here. And let's say you also want to increase convergence. We'll hold Control F6. So that's now what we want for this profile. So if I go back over to my default config here, we want it to save into this second user settings here. So we need to use the numpad 5 key, and that will temporarily update these values. You're not going to see a change in the config file here. So we'll go ahead and click 5. And then we know we don't want to have the default depth and convergence be this. So I generally leave this first hotkey here as like the default that matches the depth and convergence here. So I'm going to go ahead back in here. I'm going to click numpad 1, have that reset. So now we're ready to click that Control F7, and you hear that beep indicating that it created a profile or updated the profile based on your current settings. One other thing to note while we're in game here is the configuration has the right thumbstick click to disable the pitch and yaw. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, and now my controls don't work. But if I click it again, it will be enabled again. So you can also set that to hold, so instead of clicking the stick, you could say I want to hold the stick in, and while it's hold in, the pitch and yaw are disabled. Alright, so let's go have a look at our profile. So in your documents, My Games VRto3D, you should now have a profile named after the executable of the game. I'm going to open this up in Notepad here, and you'll see these are the settings that we saved. So there's that pitch radius in there, and you got that controller sensitivity that we changed as well. And then also for this gamepad guide preset, we have a different depth and convergence than what we have as the default up here. So now let's say if you were going to a different game or something that you didn't want to have the pitch and yaw enabled set, I'm going to undo everything here so we have that third profile for the left trigger as well. So I'm just going to continue demonstrating with Lucky here. I'm going to go ahead and click Control F10 to reload. You hear the beep saying that it loaded a profile, and it's also going to reset your camera to the default position so you're not looking off in some weird direction for the game that loaded. And this demonstrates the automatic profile loading as well. So since we just ran Lucky, I'm going to need to exit out of SteamVR because it still remembers that Lucky was the last running game. But now if I go back to Steam, and we're going to restart Lucky, you hear the beep saying that it found a profile and loaded it. Move this out of the way here. Alright, now in game, we're going to see we have our pitch and yaw settings as well as that radius. And holding like the left trigger and whatnot does not change our depth and convergence. Then that guide button will go to that setting we saved previously and toggle it back as well. One other useful hotkey is the position reset, which is on numpad 7 by default, but you can change that in the default config. But you can also see that the default config settings of disabling pitch enable and yaw enable do not affect Lucky because it has a game profile that overrides them. Back at the top of the compatibility list, let's dig into getting games running with the RealVR mods. So as of version 14.1.0, RealVR is directly compatible with VRto3D and will automatically enable camera controls. So let's go over and look at the guide here. And we'll first touch on the general notes and settings here. Down below, I've got these game-specific profiles for these games. These are the ones we're going to go through today. Now, in most games, RealVR will try to force a 1:1 aspect ratio for VR displays, and that mainly affects your 2D game window, but it may also affect some HUD elements. Sometimes you can change that safely to 16:9. Other times that will cause issues with the aspect ratio in 3D, or it may just not render 3D at all. So sometimes you have to stick to 1:1 and don't change the 16:9. You can always change the 3D aspect ratio and field of view in the VRto3D default config JSON. Now I'm going to recommend leaving the render width and height as whatever you normally use, but I'm going to use a window width and height that's smaller than my current display. This is a 2560 by 1440 display, and that's to make it easier for us to be able to access all the RealVR settings on our display. Also, it's important to make sure that pitch and yaw enable are set to false for this new version of RealVR, as those will otherwise cause issues. And we can dig in later. There are some user settings you can use, but I provided profiles for these games here, so you don't need to manually adjust them unless you want to change them. So another important thing is convergence adjustments do not work with RealVR mods. So do not use the Control F5, F6 hotkeys. And the other part of that is make sure all your user convergence settings match, because you will have issues if you try to change them in-game while a RealVR mod is running. And that includes your default ones. Make sure all of those match. Single display users need debug enable. That's the default in VRto3D now. And many games it's best to run windowed mode for the 2D view, so they can easily be put in the background or moved to a separate window or monitor. And you also have to have 14.1.0 for these instructions. Some older RealVR mods are playable with some a little bit janky camera. You can see those here. That includes those mods that were discontinued by Luke Ross. The HFOV and VFOV optimizations do not work with VRto3D. So, getting started, you need to go to Luke Ross's Patreon. I've got that pulled up here, and you need to get at least version 14.1.0. So he hasn't updated the first post yet, so we'll pull it from here. And I've already downloaded this over in this folder over here. So we'll be using this throughout our installations. And I'm going to go back to our guide here. Now it's important, if you previously installed RealVR to a game, to go ahead and just completely remove it by deleting the real repo folder, these DLL files, the bat file, INI file, and the log. And that makes sure you're not going to have any issues with the version being outdated or the settings being incorrect. So these here are just some general guidelines for installing RealVR. We'll get into more depth in the game-specific ones. There's some general controls here that are good to know. The pause key will bring up the RealVR menu. Usually you need to set the normal HUD size to 0.8 so that it's actually on your screen and not stretching off the top and bottom. Holding the control key and then scrolling your mouse will zoom the text. And then you can also change values by using your arrow keys to select them and then pressing enter. Auto for the VR renderer usually works fine, but you can also just change it to OpenXR here. Sometimes you're going to change the render resolution in RealVR. Sometimes it's going to be changed in game. It varies, so we'll go on it on a case-by-case basis here. And then finally, about the render modes, there's the Legacy AER, which has the least amount of additional artifacts, but you're going to have that kind of a little bit juddery movement when the camera's panning because the left and right are not synchronized. 1/2 rate is also a type of AER, but it's a lot smoother. Unfortunately, it can have blocky tearing artifacts. Here, for example, you can see Jin's head here has been turned into pixelated blocks. This only happens when the frame rate drops below your target frame rate. So make sure you have your frame rate high enough where you have good enough performance in game to avoid this. And alongside that, both of these can have a eye flip happen when the frame rate drops too low. And this final piece here, this is automatic now, but if for some reason the camera does not control normally in game, you can try adding this line in the RealVR.ini. So let's jump into our first game, Cyberpunk. Go ahead and expand it here. So make sure SteamVR is closed if it's running. And then you need to save this profile to your Documents, My Games, VRto3D folder. Documents, My Games, then VRto3D. And we'll save it there. And so this one gives you a lower depth preset when you're holding the left trigger, and you can swap to a higher depth preset using the guide button. But this game kind of needs a lower depth because a lot of things get very close to you. You can also go in there, and if you want to, so here I'll open it real quick. You could replace this left trigger. You could replace it with that right mouse button, VKR mouse, if you want it to instead be triggered by the mouse. Now for Cyberpunk, it has a really nasty temporal anti-aliasing that causes ghosting, especially when you're aiming down sights and whatnot. So we're going to first go over to your Cyberpunk directory. Got it pulled up here. We'll go Cyberpunk, and it's engine, config, platform, PC, then user ini. So I'll open this up. I've already done this on my end, but copy this in, save this file, and they can close out of it. That disables TAA, but the game still needs some kind of anti-aliasing. So we're going to go back up to Cyberpunk. We go back to our bin, x64 folder, and you're going to want to download the latest reshade. So I've got a version over here. I'm going to run this. Click OK on this. Just go ahead and click Browse. And you need to go to this folder, copy it, paste it here. And we'll select Cyberpunk, click Open, click Next, DirectX 12, Next, and you want Suite Effects here. And click Next, Next, Finish. After that's done, we don't want to load Suite Effects through Reshade, we want to load it through RealVR. So we're going to go ahead and delete this dxgi.dll. So now we need to go over to our RealVR zip here, and we're going to just extract all of this into the folder here. I'll minimize this, and now let's scroll down. We need to find our realconfig.bat. So you run this, it'll ask for admin, click yes. I'll run through here, and then press any key to exit. Okay, so let's now go and run Cyberpunk from Steam. And click play. Game's going to start up here. RealVR is going to start. And in a moment here, you'll hear that beep indicating that it loaded our VRto3D for this game. So go ahead and click pause to dismiss this menu here. Go ahead and let it get in game. First thing we're going to do here is change some in-game settings. We want to make this so we can see it better, as well as we want to change the render resolution for 3D. So we're going to go ahead and go game, and go to settings, go to video, and if you have multiple monitors, you can change this to another monitor. Change from window borderlands to windowed, and change this down to what your render resolution is. For me, it's 1920 by 1080. Go ahead and click apply. Now go over to graphics, and in my case, I'm disabling ray tracing. Increase the field of view if you want. I recommend turning all of these off. So now we're ready to change the RealVR settings. We need to move this out over here so we can see it better. And we're going to exit out of the settings. Click pause, and this will pull up the RealVR menu here. So in my case, I need this 1920 by 1056 is the closest on this target pixels per degree that I can get. So once it's there, you'll click Adapt Resolution, move your game window around, move it back over here so you can see. Now, I like to put the HUD distance at 10. Let's go over here, expand these RealVR settings, and so I have pictures here of these settings that I used. You need the normal HUD size at 0.8 usually. And you can also, if you're having trouble sliding this, click on it, move with the arrow keys, click enter. You can type in a number and then hit enter again, and you can apply it that way. We're going to change render mode up to 1/2, and I think everything else on this page is good. So let's move on to the CP 2077 page. So you need to disable this 3D for world map and character creation. Unfortunately, it changed the field of view to this tiny field of view, and you cannot see the buttons you're clicking on for those, so you have to leave it as a 2D view. We're going to go ahead and click this Always Preserve Depth Buffer for reshade. We need that for the anti-aliasing. And what else do we need? I don't think any of these settings are really important. You can experiment with them if you run into some issue. We do need to go in here and change this first-person camera offset. Set this back to 0. Because otherwise you'll have trouble seeing like computer screens and whatnot. And check the GPU throttling. Set that at -1, so that's good. Alright, so let's dig into the anti-aliasing here. We're going to go over to this reshade tab, and you'll notice I pulled in all these effects here. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to pull SMAA up to the top here. And then FXAA we're going to drag up right under it. I'm going to enable both of these. Now, I didn't change any settings for FXAA. I think it's good as is. We're going to go ahead and take all these settings that are listed here. So edge detection, I'm going to use the keyboard to input these. 8.090, and this one's 0.001, 32, 16, 25, 0.01, 2.0, 0.4, none. And don't touch any of these other ones. After this is done, go ahead and click this performance mode here. And then we should be good on RealVR settings. I'm going to go ahead and click pause and close out of this. And we should already have in our headset window here the 3D display. Now I'm going to go ahead and restart the game to make sure everything looks good and that it starts correctly at the right resolution and windowed mode and all that. So back on Steam, go ahead and click play. Play again. The second time you won't hear the beep because the Cyberpunk profile's already been loaded. But it's loading in windowed mode, which is good. Alright, press space to continue. I'm going to go ahead and load a game here. Click continue.
Hey everyone, feels great.
Now if you're using single display mode, go ahead and go over to your headset window, Control F8, and then go over to your Cyberpunk window, Alt Tab,
afraid some local fishermen might
space here.
harpoon it.
Now in single display mode you can't use your mouse and keyboard, but in multi-display mode you can. So in single display mode you'll have to use a controller. But everything seems to be working correct here. So we'll go ahead and exit the game. And we'll press Control F8 to turn off that foregrounding. And that covers Cyberpunk. So let's jump into our next game, Elden Ring. I've already expanded it here. If you have SteamVR running, go ahead and close it out. And let's download the VRto3D profile for it. Save it into our documents, My Games, VRto3D. Alright. Now let's go over to where the game's located. It's under Elden Ring Game. And you got your exe here. We're going to go ahead and copy in all of our RealVR files. Do that. And then we'll scroll down, find the realconfig.bat, give it admin, and I can run this at medium-ish. So I'm choosing medium, and press enter to close that. And now we can launch the game from Steam. Now, when you run it just with the RealVR mod, you'll get this pop-up block here. But when you run it with seamless co-op, you won't see this. It'll just go straight to VR. Give it a minute. There's the profile load and the VRto3D load. Alright, so over in the 2D window, let's go ahead and hit pause to dismiss the RealVR menu. Now if you end up with this weird situation with the screen getting offset here, what you need to do is open up RealVR with pause, go over to here, and we'll click stop VR. Wait a moment, and then I'm going to have to use my arrow keys to choose start VR up there again. Press spacebar. A second. Alright, and now you're back to normal position and good to go. Now we'll use our controller. I'm going to go down to System, and we're going to change some settings here. So we want to run this in windowed mode to make it easier to background this 2D game or move it to another monitor. Let's go ahead and turn off ray tracing for my setup. Go into advanced. Anti-aliasing, you want this on low for any setup because that turns off TAA. Turn off depth of field and motion blur. And I'm just going to move a couple things here. There we go. And now I'm going to go ahead and load the game. Certain settings in RealVR you can only change in-game. Now the annoying thing is that the RealVR GUI will not show on the 2D window, but it will show on your headset window, so we're going to have to do a little bit of juggling here. I'm going to go ahead and minimize Steam, and let's go over to the guide again. So I'm going to expand the RealVR settings here. So we're going to open up this first menu, and the things we're going to turn off are this preset down here, and I'm going to set the camera and the rendering mode. So I need to show the headset, and then go over to the game window. All right. So turn off that preset. Switch to game default camera and 1/2 rate. And then you can click this top button here and that'll bring up the main VRto3D window. I'll expand it a little bit here and you can use the control mouse wheel to zoom it. So you don't need to change anything at the top here. I like to throw the HUD out to 10. And in this game, 1.0 seems to be okay. You can also increase this to 1.15, I think it is. So I'm going to hit enter and we'll go 1.15. And I think everything else here is good. Let's go ahead and check, compare to our guide. Yep. And then just one last thing to check. Go over to the Elden tab and make sure timescale is 1.0 and you already have the game default camera. Everything else looks good. Okay, so this game should be ready to go now, and you can see you can look around just like normal. And let's go ahead and exit. All right, and now let's go and install Seamless Co-op. Open this up on another tab here. You will need a Nexus account if you don't have one. Go ahead and manually download it. I already have it over here, so I'm just going to open it up and go back to the Elden Ring. And I'm going to copy this in here. I'm going to overwrite in this case. And then there's one setting you have to change. You go into Seamless Co-op, RSC settings, and you have to set a password. Just put something random. Close that one. Close this. All right, now back in the game folder. You want to launch the game with this ERSC launcher, and we'll try running it here. You can see it's loading RealVR there. Alright. I don't have a really good save on Seamless Co-op currently, but we'll load in game and you can see it's working just fine. Right, so we'll go ahead and exit Elden Ring. And that concludes the setup for Elden Ring. Okay, let's now jump into Ghost of Tsushima. Go ahead and expand the instructions here. Now, one important thing to note about this game is it does not work with the Steam overlay with RealVR. So if you have the Steam overlay enabled, you can disable it in Steam, Settings, In-Game, and then turn it off here. So go ahead and do that if you haven't. So we'll go ahead and download the profile for this game in VRto3D. Close SteamVR if it's running. So go ahead and click this. I'm going to save it here. And this one also just sets a toggle on the guide button that'll toggle between the higher and lower depth presets. So we need to browse to our Ghost of Tsushima files, and we're going to extract our RealVR into here. We'll go ahead and replace those. And then we'll come over here and we're going to run config.bat. Give it admin, and everything looks good there. And then we're going to boot the game. Okay, and click pause. You can see RealVR started up here, and the profile loaded with that beep. Skip this. This game can be a little bit tricky with where the RealVR loads, and you can see in the background there that the in-game menu is tiny. So if you can't see RealVR, you can try, you should be able to see like this aspect ratio and adapt resolution. So you should be able to kind of slide those around. You can also adjust the HUD distance and the HUD size to try to get that working. I'm going to set these, I think it's 2.8 and 10, and then we'll drag this target pixels per degree. I know 1820 by 1080 is like 16.4. And then click Adapt Resolution, and you'll see it kind of snap to a nicer size here. And then it moved that HUD back over there. So we also need to change this to 1/2 rate. And I think that's all for this tab. Let's go over here and we'll expand the RealVR settings, and I think we're good. Okay, so now we need to go to the Ghost of Tsushima tab, and all these HUD scale, you need to drag them all up to 1.0. And now in game, the menu will be normal. So let's go ahead and go over to options and then display. You want to set it to windowed so that it's more easy to move around and all that. And just leave aspect ratio to auto. I'm going to leave off upscale method. You can play with this and see if it causes any artifacting issues. You can set dynamic resolution scaling up. This will hopefully prevent performance going too low and getting eye flips. Anti-aliasing, I find TAA in this game to not be bad. But if you have an issue with it, you can drop it down to SMAA. And make sure frame generation is off. And let's go back. And apply changes. Apply changes. Graphics. And there's a few things we need to turn off here. Make sure motion blur is all the way off. Make sure depth of field is off. And vignette is off. The other settings I've adjusted for performance. And let's double check that. Alright, so that looks good. We'll back out. One final note on the RealVR settings. I go back and forth on this game if I prefer the 1/2 rate or the legacy AER. So just play with it and see what feels comfortable to you. I think I'd slightly give it to the 1/2 rate. So I'll go ahead and load my game here. And let's go ahead and pull up our headset window so you can see that it's working. And we got our game window there. Alright, so in game we can move around and have normal camera movement. You can see those occasional little artifacts from the 1/2 rate. Alright, and I think we can exit out. And Ghost of Tsushima is good to go. Alright, so let's jump into Horizon Zero Dawn. So go ahead and close SteamVR if it's running. And we're going to download this VRto3D profile to your Documents folder there. Alright, and then let's go over to the Horizon Zero Dawn executable folder. We're going to extract RealVR into here. Replace if you need to. And then we're going to come and run the realconfig.bat and give it administration privileges and press any key to continue. Now let's go over to Steam and then Horizon. Now this game seems to need a Steam input enabled, so you can click the controller and enable Steam input in here. Another note, this game's a little bit tricky to get through all the menus on single display. So we'll kind of jump through it here, and you can use a second display if that's more convenient for you. So we'll go ahead and click play here. Now when you first boot this game, it's probably going to get stuck on a kind of a black screen. What you're going to have to do is hit Alt-Enter to make it force full screen for a bit until you can navigate over to the settings, and you may have to keep Alt-tabbing over to the game. You need to get to display and set display resolution to 1:1 aspect ratio, and set the aspect ratio to 1:1 as well, and display mode to borderless. That's all to make sure that cutscenes render properly in 16:9 instead of being super chunky. The other thing is in graphics, the only thing you have to set here is motion blur to off, but I'm going to go down to original quality and make sure motion blur is off. Apply. Now a few more notes about settings. If you have the audio coming from the wrong location, you can go and change that in the output device here. We'll go back over to display. If you want to, you can also enable this adaptive performance, and that will try to help keep 3D more stable when you're running at that half rate or alternate eye rendering modes. Okay, and we'll escape out. Now I'm going to pull up the RealVR menu with pause, and if you can't see all of it here, what you got to do is click in here somewhere. Then use your arrow keys. Let's try clicking a little bit up here somewhere. There we go. There's the arrow keys. And find this normal HUD size. We hit enter. Type in 0.8. Hit enter. And now let's go ahead and drag this over, and we can use the mouse wheel scroll to make it bigger. Okay, so now I'm going to click in here again. I'm going to use the arrow keys again. Go down to render mode, spacebar, and click 1/2 rate, spacebar. And also adjust the normal HUD distance to 10. So I'm going to click at the top here, use my arrow keys down to it, spacebar, and then move it all the way over, and spacebar again. Now we need to go over to the HZD tab, and you gotta click, disable that first person, and arrow keys down to this other first person, disable that, and GPU throttling -1 should be good. Okay, so now we can close out of the RealVR menu. Now if for some reason the display gets offset here when you later boot the game, you can open the RealVR menu, you can click Stop VR, and then Start VR afterwards. You can also use spacebar to click on it. And that should get you recentered. And so let's go ahead and click Continue. Alright, so we're in game, and we've got our normal camera, and there's that guide button. We'll swap between those two depth presets. And then holding the left trigger, we'll also go to that medium depth preset. Alright, so now we can exit out and then exit game. And that concludes the Horizon Zero Dawn tutorial. Now let's jump into our final game for today, Spider-Man. So the Steam overlay will also conflict with this game, so make sure it's closed out. And in this game, any aspect ratio other than 1:1 is going to cause issues with rendering. So if you have some issues with getting the game to trigger VR to 3D, you may need to go to the PC Gaming Wiki and go and nuke your settings in these locations. So let's start and make sure SteamVR is not running. And we're going to go ahead and download the profile for Spider-Man, save it off to here. And the main thing this does is set the guide button to toggle between a lower and a higher depth preset. So in our Marvel Spider-Man Remastered folder here, we're going to extract RealVR in here, and I'm going to run the realconfig.bat, give it admin, and press any key to continue. And now we're going to go ahead and launch the game. And we'll click play here. Here's RealVR starting up. There's the profile load for VRto3D. Click in here and click pause. Alright, let's skip that. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive into in-game settings first. We'll switch it out to look like this. So annoyingly, this game won't render the UI and the 2D view. So we have to go back and forth here a little bit. So for your resolution, you're going to want to adjust this using RealVR. For the displaying graphics, since we can't see this, let me pull up RealVR real quick. And we're going to click in here, use arrow keys again, and we're going to change our normal HUD size 0.8, and then the HUD distance, spacebar, roll that over there. Alright, we'll come back to you in a minute. So in the in-game settings, we want to set window mode to windowed, And leave aspect ratio as auto. Leave VSync on, I guess. And you want frame generation off. And upscale method off. You can change the dynamic resolution scaling if you want to. I'm going to set it 60. Then also turn anti-aliasing to SMAA instead of TAA. TAA will look smoother in some cases. We'll get bad ghosting. So let's go over to the graphics tab here. And most of these are for performance on my side. Ray trace off. And let's come down here. You need depth of field to be off. Chromatic aberration off. Vignette off. Motion blur strength to 0. Film grain to 0. And that's all here. Go back. And let's finish up with RealVR. So I'm gonna use control and mouse wheel. Let's see, to make this bigger. Pull this over here a little bit. Okay, so first thing we're gonna need to do is adjust this render resolution here. I'm gonna use enter here. I'm gonna type in 14.4. 14.5 is about what I'm running. That's 1696 by 1696. You can run this higher if you have a better GPU. I'm running a 2080 Ti. And I think that's all we needed to change here. So go to the Spidey tab, and you don't need to touch anything here. Just make sure time scale is normal. And can close out of RealVR, and we can go and click continue here. We'll load into game.
Already late.
All
I should get to the lab ASAP.
And you can see everything's running pretty good here. Camera control and all. And you can press that guide button to switch between the different depth presets there. And we'll just go ahead and quit the game now. Finally, at the end here, once you have configured all the RealVR mods that you want to set up, be sure to go in and change your window width and height back to the ones needed for your full screen display. Make sure that's matching your maximum desktop resolution. And when you're using the mod, remember if you're on a single display, that you'll have to use Control F8 to foreground the VRto3D headset window, and then you can Alt-Tab over to the game window for control to work. If you're on a multi-display, you can drag the game window over to your second screen and have VRto3D full screen on your 3D monitor or other 3D display. And that'll wrap up this video.